Hey there, I'm Douglas from Draftbit. Today, we're diving into the list component. This is an essential part of building dynamic interfaces in Draftbit. The list component allows us to display a repeating set of items, making it incredibly useful for showcasing things like product lists, user profiles, or even chat messages. The list component works independently or as a child of the fetch component to display items pulled from the variable or an external API. This flexibility makes it a powerful tool for dynamically rendering data in your application. To start, let's add the fetch component. In Draftbit, head over to the component picker, click add, then you're going to look for the fetch component. If you don't see it on the first screen, search for fetch. Then let's add that to the screen. This component will allow us to pull data from an external source like an API, and then we're able to pass it down to our list. So we go ahead to our fetch. Then we go to the data tab where it says service, we click, and then we have an API called Draftbit examples. So this is an API that I went ahead and created. The endpoint that we're going to be using is called users. So it grabs a list of users, and then we're able to get the data back. So we have a list of 5 users. Now we're ready to add the list component. Again, we go to our component picker. While list, we're on the fetch component. We click add, then we search for list component. Now let's go ahead and click the list component. Then on the list component, we go ahead to data, and the first thing that we see is the data property. We go to that data property, it has a drop down, and we pass in the top level response. So the top level response is the data that is coming from the fetch. So the fetch gets our data from our API. The data comes back as an object array like this. And then that data gets passed down to the list. So now our list now has that data. So how does the list component work? So once the list component gets this object array of data, the list component is going to loop through each item in this array that we pass to it. For each item in the data array, it creates an instance of its child components. This means that if we add, for example, a text component as the child component of the list, it will render a text component for each item in the array. Let's do that now. So we go ahead to our list, then we're going to add a text component. And notice how we're going to get 5 text components on the screen. Why do we get 5 text components in the screen? Because the list has looped through the data and found out that the data that we got from the fetch component has 5 items. So it has 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? So the list component loops through that data and passes it down to its children. So now we have 5 texts. And what we want to do, we want to go to the list, then we want to go to style, and we want to add gap. So gap is just space in between components. And what you're going to see is we're going to have a bit of spacing. Then next, we want to go to text, go to data, and on text. So we have these curly bracelets. What these do is they create a variable. So once I click outside, it creates a variable, and I can assign anything that I want to the variable. And notice how Draftbit automatically gets all these list items for you, right? And these list items, so it looped through the list, and now we have access to the ID, the bio, the email, the phone number from all our data that came from the fetch. So from now, I just want the full name. And let's go to the device preview and click web preview. And as you can see, we're able to see all the names. Let's go to our list again and add an image. Before I have the text and image, I want to have a view. So we can add a view to this list. And what I want to do is I want to put the text in the view. Then I want to put the image in the view. And then I'm now able to style that view. So in the view, I can say I want all the items in this view to be centered. And you'll notice that the name and image are going to go to the center. Then again, you notice how the name and the image, they are touching each other. So we just go to the view, and what we want to add again is gap. So just say 5, and that adds gap between the name and the image. It's not much, but you can see the difference. Then now what I want to do on the image, I want to go to the data property. On URL, I want to put another variable. So this is what we call a variable. So once I have these curly bracelets, it creates a variable. Once I click outside, you're going to see it creates a variable. And what I want to do, I want to go down here. And remember, since we're in the list, we have access to the list item, which has all this looped data. So what I want is the avatar. So that's usually an image. As you can see, we now get the image. And then what I want to do, go back to the fetch, and you see on the fetch I have this limit. So I'm limiting to only 5 results. So for now, let's put 20. So we can see the full power of a list. Yeah, it's hard to scroll through 5 items, right? So now we have 20 items, and you can see we can now scroll through. Now that our list component is connected to data from the fetch component, let's explore the properties available in the data tab, starting with row. So let's go back to our list. Let's go back to data. And the first thing that you see is the row. The row property is specific to a component that are children of the fetch component. So whenever you make something a child of the fetch component, it will inherit this property called the row. It provides 3 possible states. So here it has a drop down. It has data, loading, and error. If row is set to data, it means that the data has been successfully loaded and is available. Loading indicates that the data is still being fetched, and error signifies that there was an issue retrieving the data. Using this property, we can display components conditionally based on the state of the fetch request. For example, we could display a loading spinner when the row is set to loading, or an error message when it's set to error. Up next, we have data. We've already touched on this, but to recap briefly, the data property is where we specify the array of items the list will render. The data can come from a variable, an API, or in this case, the response from our fetch component. Up next, we have item unique key. The item unique key property lets you set a unique identifier for each item in the list. By default, Draftbit will look for an ID field in each object, which is common in most APIs. If your data uses a different key for unique identification, you can specify it here to avoid rendering conflicts or duplication issues. So yeah, you can come in here and you can specify a new key if that's what you want. But by default, Draftbit goes in, gets this .id that we have here. There's no need to put anything here. By default, it knows. Then we have the re-render data. This property is useful when components inside the list rely on data outside the data prop. When these dependencies change, you can place them in the re-render data to trigger the list to re-render. So in here, we can have a variable in here. And if this variable changes, our list is going to re-render. Up next, we have number of columns. This determines how the list displays items horizontally, with the default value being 1. So right now you can see we have 1 column. So if we come in here and say 3 columns, our data is going to be evenly split into 3 columns. And as you can see, our data is now split into 3 columns. So 1, 2, and 3. The last property in the data tab is the scroll enabled. Scroll enabled controls whether the list component is scrollable. By default, this is enabled to allow a user to be able to scroll through the list. But we can also come in here and say scroll enabled to false. So that means we want to disable this. And users will no longer be able to scroll through our list. Now, when I try to scroll, it scrolls the whole device. It no longer scrolls the list. Now that we understand the data tab, let's move on to the configuration tab. So if you come here, there's the config tab. And the first thing that we see is the component name. The component name property is simply the name of the component as it appears in the screen's component tree. So if we come here to the left side, we have this component tree, and this is the name as it appears. So if I say list, so if I say, for example, users list, and save that, you will notice that in the component tree, it's going to change. Then up next, we have horizontal. The list displays items in a horizontal scrollable format rather than the default vertical setup. This option is great for creating horizontal carousels or sliders within your app. So vertical is from up to down, but then horizontal is if we want our list to go from left to right. So if we click horizontal, our list is going to go from left to right. And now we can scroll. Let's have that back to normal. Up next, we have inverted. This option reverses the order of the lists. This setting is useful for displaying things like chat screens where new messages should appear at the bottom and the list scrolls up. So if you see right now, the first person is Susan. If we invert the list, we're going to get the last person as the first person. So if we now go up, we get Jose. And if we go down, we get Susan is now at the bottom. So our list has been inverted. Up next, we have the initial number to render. This property controls how many items the list should render on the initial load. Setting this to a lower number can improve performance, as the list won't try to load every item at once. So you're telling the list how many items should you try to load on the first initial load. So if I say I want you to load maybe 10, so it's just going to load the first 10 on the initial load, right? But on subsequent loads, it's going to get all of them. So this helps the application with performance issues. Up next, we have end reached threshold. End reached threshold specifies how close to the end of the list the user must scroll to trigger an action, such as loading more data. This is typically set as a fraction of the visible length of the list. For instance, setting this to 0.5 triggers the on end reached when the user has scrolled halfway through the visible content, right? Okay, so we're saying that as we're scrolling through the list and we've reached halfway through the visible content, then we can trigger this end reached threshold. You're going to see when we go to interactions how that works. Then up next, we have show horizontal scroll indicator. So when I'm scrolling, you see that this indicator appears. So by default, it's enabled. I can disable it and it should hide that horizontal scroller. So now I don't see it anymore. Then up next, we have show vertical scroll indicator. Similar to the vertical scroll indicator, it makes the vertical indicator visible along the side of the list. So remember when our list was going from left to right, below that we had another indicator. So we can turn that off. Then the last one, we have allow touch events. So this controls how the list interacts with other elements on the screen when the keyboard is active. By default, the keyboard would dismiss when a touch event occurs, like pressing a button. If you allow the touch event to always, the keyboard will remain visible even after a touch event. This can be useful if the list is part of a form or an input-based layout where you want the keyboard to stay up. So sometimes we have a list that's part of a form, and by default, if you click outside the input, the keyboard goes away. Sometimes we want the keyboard to always be up. Yeah, so since we don't have an input, I can't really show you an example, but yeah, that's what it does. If we have it as always, even if we have an input that brings out the keyboard and the user clicks outside or clicks the return key, we expect that the keyboard is going to close. But yeah, if we have it set to always, the keyboard won't close. Now that we've covered configurations, let's move further to interactions. The list component in Draftbit includes several powerful interaction triggers that let you respond to user actions, adding interactivity and enhancing the user experience. Here's a look at each of the triggers available. So the first one that we have is the onRefresh. So the onRefresh trigger allows you to refresh the data displayed in the list by pulling down the list or refreshing the list. When the users pull down or any action you attach on the onRefresh will run, such as refetching data or updating the list. We're going to have an example and you're going to see what this does. But for now, let me just explain what all of these do as a whole. Then we'll come back and we'll go through each one and show you how it gets triggered. Next up, we have onEndReached. This is activated when the user scrolls near the end of the list. This trigger works in conjunction with the endReached threshold configuration property. So if we go back to config, we remember this property on endReached threshold of 0.5. So it works in conjunction with this. So here you're specifying what you call the end, right? And then here it's going to follow that rule. So if I say the end is 0.5, as you view the first half of the list and you start viewing the second half, it's going to trigger this. Then lastly, we have onScroll. So this just runs whenever you're scrolling through the list. This is the most straightforward one. And what we want to do now is want to go through. So on refresh, when we click it, it opens an action editor. So an action editor, what does this do? An action editor allows us to perform actions when this is triggered. So we can perform a myriad of actions. We can make an API request to the backend to get more data. But what I want to do now is I just want to console log. So when this runs, I just want to say item is refreshed. Okay, then I close that. Then on endReached, I want another console log that just says end is reached. Then on scroll, I want a console log that says list is being scrolled. Okay, we close that. Then what we need to do now is we need to open this console log, and then we go to our device preview. We go on iOS preview, then we say tap to play. So this tap to play is going to run this iOS device. We now have our list on an iOS device, and the first thing that I want to trigger is the on scroll. So I'm just going to scroll through the list, and notice that our console runs, list is being scrolled. And then as we finish the first half, proceeding to the second half of the list, we're going to reach on end reached. Right, and as you can see, on end is reached. And then if we go to the start of our list and we pull down on the list, you notice there's this indicator, this loading indicator that's spinning. So our list is being refreshed. And if we come here, we're going to see item is being refreshed. So yeah, that's how we run those triggers. And instead of having these console logs, like I said, here on refresh, we can actually we can delete this. And instead of, showing it on the console, we can actually make an API request to get more data, because we're refreshing and we need to get more data. So yeah, you can do many things with this action editor. Now that we've set up interaction triggers, let's move on to styling options. So if we come back here, we go to styles. And yeah, for this, we don't have many component-specific styles, because what we want you to do with this component is we want you to style it using the standard styling options that Draftbit provides for all components. So these are your layouts, these are your background color, your size, your margin and padding, and your position. Yeah, so for this, we just have the refreshing color. So when we're refreshing this list, that indicator that you saw that was black, we can actually change the color of that indicator. So we can have it be red, we can have it be any color that we want. And yeah, that's a wrap. Now you've learned how to use the list component in Draftbit, from setting it up with data, exploring configuration options, to adding interactions and customizing the stylings. The list component is very versatile. And as you've seen, it can be configured in numerous ways to suit whatever application that you're trying to build. If you found this tutorial helpful, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more Draftbit tutorials. We'll continue diving into more components, tips and tricks to help you build your application quickly and effectively. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.